What's going on, everyone? Welcome back. Patrick here. Moving on to the next concept, I'm now going to talk about type 1 versus type 2 errors, and you're definitely going to see these concepts come up in your course. You're definitely going to be tested on them as well. And this is not the only video where I'm going to talk about these two types of errors. I'm going to be mentioning them in future videos, future examples, but as usual, I'm going to start at a high level, give you a higher level understanding of what these are. And then as the videos progress, we'll get more and more technical. So as a little review from the previous video when we first started talking about hypothesis testing, I mentioned that this is the general process that we're going to go through. So there's going to be a null hypothesis or a statement about a population parameter that's already known. That's the status quo. And what's going to happen is someone's going to come along and challenge that null hypothesis, and they're going to give an alternative hypothesis, right, which is the opposite of the null. And then we're going to have to do some hypothesis testing. We're going to have to take a sample, and I'm still going to go into more detail about how this works. We're still keeping it high level here. So there's going to be hypothesis testing done, and then depending on the results of the hypothesis testing, you're either going to fail to reject the null, right? Another way to think about this is accepting the null to still be true, right? Fail to reject the null or accept the null, or you're going to reject the null. You're going to see that there's enough evidence showing that the alternative hypothesis is more true than the null hypothesis, right? So those are the two sort of conclusions that you could draw from hypothesis testing. Well, I'm going to expand on this further now. So these two conclusions, those are the two conclusions you can draw, but the underlying reality is either the null is going to be true or it's going to be false, right? And as I mentioned in the previous video, we can't prove something is true, but let's just assume that we know what the underlying reality is that it is actually true, right? Or it is actually false. And then same thing here. Either, if we reject the null, either the null is true or it's going to be false, right? So those are the four sort of situations that can happen from these two conclusions. And so let's talk about each of these one by one. So if we fail to reject the null hypothesis, right, or we accept the null hypothesis, so in our hypothesis testing, we see there's not enough evidence to go against the null, right? So we fail to reject it or we continue to accept it as true. And if it actually is true, then what? Then, let me put this in a different color here, then we've made a correct decision. Right? If we accepted the null and the null is actually true, it's a correct decision. But what if we accept the null or we fail to reject the null, but it's actually false in reality, which can happen? Well, that is an error. Because if the null is false, and if our hypothesis testing was done well enough, then we should have rejected the null if it is false. But if we accept it and it's false, then that's an error. Now, what if we reject the null? If we reject the null, then from our hypothesis testing means there's more evidence pointing towards the alternative being true versus the null, right? So if that happens, then we have to reject the null. But what if we reject the null and the null is actually true? Well, that's an error as well. And if we reject the null and the null is actually false, then we made the correct decision, right? So 4 different scenarios, 2 correct scenarios, and then 2 errors over here. And this error over here, when you accept a null or fail to reject a null and the null is actually false, it's called a type 2 error. And if you reject the null, but the null is actually true, that's called a type 1 error. And actually, a good way to remember all of this, the way that I like to do it personally, it just allows me to file it in my mind a little bit better, is I mentioned this in the previous video, that you can compare this process to a court of law. And I'm actually going to keep comparing this to a court of law in future videos as well, because there's just so many similarities. So if we go from the beginning, null hypothesis, remember I compared this to assumed innocence, right? Everyone is assumed innocent until proven guilty. Well, what happens is someone comes along and presses charges on this statement here, on this innocent statement, saying that the statement or that person is actually guilty, right? And so what has to happen is we need to go to trial, right? So that's where the hypothesis testing is done. And then from the trial, there's going to be two conclusions. Either there's going to be no conviction, right? The defendant, this null hypothesis, is going to be found not guilty, right? That's what it means to accept the null or fail to reject it. It means there's no conviction. Or if we reject the null, we reject the innocence, that means there is a conviction. They're found guilty, right? So there's more evidence pointing towards the alternative hypothesis. And then we can go to the underlying reality. So if there's no conviction and the null is true, when the null is true, that's the same thing as saying that in reality, they're actually innocent, right? So if there's no conviction and they're actually innocent, that's a correct decision. But if there's no conviction and the null is false, when the null is false, that's the same thing as them being guilty in reality, right? So if there's no conviction, but they're actually guilty, well, that's an error, right? There should have been a conviction. So a type 2 error you could think of as like a wrongful acquittal, right? Versus here, if there's a conviction, but the null is true, meaning that the null is innocent, the defendant is innocent, then that's an error, right? That's a wrongful conviction. And if there's a conviction and the null is false, meaning that it's actually guilty, then that's the correct decision, right? So type 2 errors, wrongful acquittals. Type 1 errors are wrongful convictions. You could even compare it to like real life situations. Sometimes I do that to even help myself remember. So if you think about someone who was not convicted, but in the public's eye, right? Many people think that they were guilty. There's a lot of evidence pointing towards guilt, was O.J. Simpson, right? So you could think of that as like a type 2 error. And then this here, type 1 error, is a wrongful conviction. So someone that was put in jail when they were actually innocent. A couple of scenarios that come to mind, like Central Park 5. It's a documentary about 5 teenagers. They got wrongfully convicted in New York. Another movie that comes to mind is The Hurricane with Denzel Washington. Amazing movie, by the way. If you haven't watched it, I highly recommend you do. It's a true story about a boxer, Reuben Carter, who got wrongfully convicted and sent to jail. Right? So you could compare these to maybe real life situations, and maybe that will help you remember it better as well. So as a quick summary of this video, type 1 error, that's when you're rejecting the null when the null is actually true. So comparing it to trial, it's like a wrongful conviction. It's when innocent people go to jail. And then type 2 error is when you fail to reject the null or you accept the null, both mean the same thing, when the null is false. So that's like a wrongful acquittal, and that's when guilty people are in the public, right? So that's the difference between both types of errors. As I mentioned, I'm going to continue talking about these in future videos. I'm going to get more specific. There's actually probabilities related to both of these, but as the videos go on, I'll get into that then.